Yeah, I played in a band in London, Ontario one time, and we had 2 people show up for the crowd. It was like, there was more people on staff than there was in attendance. We're good? All right. Good morning. Some people actually showed up, and I'm really appreciative of that. I'm here to talk to you today about digital supply chain and a lot of the reasons as to why this is a thing for me. There will be a bit of a commingling between the physical realm as well as the digital realm because they're pretty much linked in no uncertain terms. So, hi. My name is Dave Lewis, and I have been doing this for the better part of 2 decades. About 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, I actually crossed the floor and I joined the vendor space because I heard they had cookies. So I'm actually very happy that I made that jump. And rather than blather on about my entire CV, you can always find me on LinkedIn. So I have done it for 2 decades. I have done all kinds of different roles. I've done everything from, firewall admin right up to an acting CISO, and I literally have the scars to prove it. Well, not literally, but scars on my psyche count. It works. I've had enough of these dropped on my head over time that I have learned to cringe if I hear the phone ring anytime after 10 p.m. or before 7 a.m. And it's always been an interesting thing when that phone rings in the middle of the night because it's never good news. And when I was doing IT support back when the world was flat, it was definitely never good news. So what have I been doing lately? Rather than standing in front of the slides. Some of the things that I do, I write for Forbes, CSO Online. You can read the rest of it there. And none of this would be possible without the support of my wife, so I always have to say that because otherwise she'll have words with me. So nowadays I work for Akamai, which is a little company you might have heard of, and I'm pretty happy about that. But to be entirely fair, this is not a vendor pitch in any way, shape, or form. This talk really has nothing to do with what we're doing, and honest, I am not going to lead you down a primrose path in that respect. What I am here to talk about is the exposed flank of the digital supply chain. And there we go. And this has always been something near and dear to my heart. I've lived it for so many years, and I'll get into why that's a thing. So the perspective here that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to be evil and I'm going to walk across the stage just to mess with you. I have worked in various different companies, and as companies grow from your typical N-tier architecture to a global footprint, you have all these interties with all these different types of organizations, and I'm not going to stand near that speaker. And while you're doing this and having all these interconnections, you're increasing the footprint of the attack surface that you have to deal with. And hopefully that you'll be able to get some meaning out of, or some value out of, my pain. So, why am I interested? This actually all started at a very formative age for me. My grandfather had served in the Canadian Navy during World War II. And woohoo! It's good to have a Canadian in the room, or 2 actually. And while he was serving in the Navy, part of what his job was actually serving on a corvette. And a corvette was an attack sub that would actually hunt down and kill submarines. So the whole point there was to protect the supply chain. My other grandfather was actually working as a merchant marine, and the stories that came out of their experiences really helped to form my perspective unconsciously to me at the time, and I learned as I went on that this actually applied to my day job. So I learned both from the attacker's and the defender's perspective, because being a merchant marine, one of the things that they did was there was a couple of times where a corvette had taken out a German U-boat, and the German U-boat had surfaced, and my own grandfather on the merchant marine had actually recovered the passengers, so they were actually able to get all kinds of very interesting stories. So that's on the physical side. Now, this here is a graphical representation of all the trade routes, admittedly over water, globally. So these are all of the interconnects that you see from the physical realm, strictly water-based transport, shipping, as it were. And this is really interesting to put into perspective when you apply that same sort of logic to the internet. This is a map of the internet from internet-map.net. And just to give you a connection, it shows you, rather badly, but a graphical representation of all the interconnects between all the sites. So the bigger the bubble, the bigger the site, that sort of perspective. Now, I first gave this talk a year ago at Trinity College in Dublin, and that was for the Source Conference. And at the time, nobody was actually discussing digital supply chain in any way, shape, or form. Sorry, that's not entirely fair. There were a few. But nowadays, in the last couple of months, I've seen more and more articles popping up. And one of the really interesting things was I was at Interop a few weeks back, and I sat down and I actually saw a digital supply chain security talk. And I was like, this is awesome. And no, I'm not presumptuous enough to think that I influenced that, but it's just, I'm actually noticing more, which is great. So, what do I mean when I'm talking about digital supply chain? We're looking at the perspectives as they manage the interconnects of the components within your organization. So, be it from procurement, be it whatever happens to be, finance, all of these pieces play into that supply chain. And the whole idea is you want to make sure that you're securing the integrity of your systems. Damn, thought we had another person. And attackers historically would have been focused on stealing trucks. I used to work for a Toys R Us. I used to work for a company that sold toys a long time ago, and we were on the loading dock at Christmas time. And we went, pulled up the gate, and said, "Okay, great, we got to unload this. Where's the truck?" There's supposed to be a truck here. So, and the thieves had come, taken the 18-wheeler, and drove off, and they made off with all the toys. We eventually were able to run them down and catch them simply because they had GPS systems on the trucks at that time. And that was a long time ago, so that was a really early event. So you take that sort of logic and apply it to the digital realm, you're finding attackers are actually going after your intellectual property. They're going after your secret sauce. And we need to bring a greater focus on the digital supply chain. The whole perspective that I have run into time and again is, oh, we have a firewall, we're fine. We have antivirus, we're fine. No, you're not. And going back to what I was saying earlier, there's only a few people talking about it a year ago. And who was talking about it? One of them was actually Gartner. And I only found one piece on their site about this. And ostensibly they were right. They were saying that digital supply chain security is going to become a real issue for organizations by 2017. I would offer that they are right to an extent that, yes, it is an issue, but I would say that the issue has already happened. And this is something that organizations really need to do a better job of paying attention to. The problem is with the complexities and the interconnects between the various suppliers and other pieces of your supply chain, the complexity continues to grow. So one of the things that really hit me early on was this. I remember when the digital picture frame first came out. I'm pretty much stuck on this spot, aren't I? When these digital picture frames first made it to market, I thought, I would never buy one, but then I realized I'm not the target market for this. And that was what really scared me. This is the real problem here is you could actually take these things and infect them with malware in the supply chain and ship them out to the stores. People wouldn't know, they plug into their computers. So the target market for this is our parents. My mother wanted to buy one of these. I quietly dissuaded her of the idea. And unfortunately, not too many people had that same conversation because this became a real problem. Because we actually saw articles, like this one article here by Kim Zetter is from 2008, where they were actually finding malicious software pre-installed on these devices. So that means that this was actually introduced in the manufacturing process at some point. And this is when I was like, okay, we got a supply chain issue here that we have to address. And it's really funny how these sort of things and USB drives are really convenient, but not actually a great idea. So for example, you go to any conference, go around to the vendors these days and try and get a free USB key. They don't give them out anymore, simply because of this very problem that you would actually get batches of them, get 1,000 of them, maybe 1 or 2 have malware installed on them already. It's a bit of an issue. And so this sort of vector is you're attacking the people that are least capable to deal with it, being elderly octogenarians, folks that love the convenience of it, but don't really have the time to look at it from a security perspective. So while I was saying that security has historically been geared towards the physical, we're getting more and more focus on the digital aspect of this thing. And information technology, so let me almost jumped the queue on myself there. This lack of focus has really been a prevalent concern. So who has been really paying attention to this sort of thing? There's various organizations out there like World Customs and anti-terrorism groups and things like that, but they tend to focus strictly on the physical. I did, however, find this one particular document, ISO 28000, that deals with supply chain from a digital perspective. So this particular document, I actually purchased this for $100-ish Canadian, so what's that, $12 US? Or whatever the exchange rate is these days. And I thought, okay, this is great. This is what I've been looking for. 24 pages. It's $100, 24 pages. And very limited, and of that, the meat of it's probably about 10 pages. There are some good ideas. It is a great start. Obviously, bear in mind that the date on this is 2007, so it's something to take into account. And it hits on, dealing with a security management system to actually manage this within your organization. It deals with the activities that can affect the supply chain. So this is a great first stepping stone. Need to see more and more on this front, and I have seen more things spinning up of late, but I have not actually captured them to any great extent. So some of the highlights of ISO 28000 was they were hitting on implementing and maintaining the security management system, conforming with standards. And they also talk about seeking third-party accreditation, but as far as I could find, there was nobody that actually does this accreditation at this point. And at the bottom of it, it said, oh, it's okay, you can make a self-determination. Okay, so I'm secure. There, I just determined that I'm safe. Awesome. And the problem here is this is doing the bare minimum. But it's more than a lot of organizations have actually taken the time to do. So when you're dealing with security like this, you are running up against this problem. This is an old, tired analogy, but it works. The Maginot line is a great example. They did awesome security until somebody figured out that they could just drive around it, and it was all over but the crying. We're looking at the same sort of problem now with digital supply chains because you have firewalls, you have antivirus, sure, great. But you're not taking the time to actually secure the third-party connections that you have coming into your enterprise. And I worked in one organization where we had roughly 300, it was 300 connections from partners into our organization. Of that 300, 67 of them were properly documented. And by saying properly documented, there was actually documentation. So some of the documentation said, yes, we're connected to this vendor, full stop. Okay, of that 67, 30 of them had any sort of documentation like contact numbers, which contract this applied to, and things to that effect. So huge exposure because we have all these organizations coming in and we don't know how they're connected or that sort of thing. And so our security team, which was very new at the time, had actually saw that and we lost a great deal of sleep. So I keep going back to this, the concerted effort on the physical, we need the concerted effort on the digital. So why is this a problem when you're dealing with the security of your organization? Because I'll use this as analogous. This is an Iranian oil tanker that actually disabled their own security tracking system, or sorry, not security tracking system, their own tracking system. They wanted to avoid detection for whatever reason. Remains to be seen. Probably smuggling, probably just wanted to stay under the radar, avoid blockades, whatever it happened to be at the time. But this is an example of if you bypass the controls in your organization, these sort of things can lead to very bad places. Same sort of idea. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, you're opening yourself up to possible damages, and the law of unintended consequences is utterly merciless. And you could even open yourselves up to not just damages, but people getting into your systems, attackers getting into your secret sauce and stealing all of your information. Bad people will take advantage of you if you allow them to do so. So now I'm going to transition into a couple of war stories because I have no shortage of those. And this one in particular was one of my favorites. One organization that I was working at, we contracted with a third party to come in and do a penetration test. And they did a very good job. At 9 o'clock in the morning, I sat down at my desk in the office, put my coffee down, had my paper. Yes, I still read a paper back then. The phone rang at 9:12. The attackers had managed to gain access to our network in 12 minutes. This was an enterprise. We had the firewalls, we had the antivirus, great, but we had not actually properly connected or properly vetted the third-party connections. One of the ways they got in was actually through a third-party connection. So the device that they actually got through rhymes with Crisco, and the password also rhymed with Crisco. Fantastic. Let's just say that day went from bad. That day went from bad to worse. It's almost like punctuation. So what went wrong? We had some incidences where we had default configurations in place. We had not actually done any verification of the security controls. And this was a failing in that this was an organization that had historically outsourced security. And then when the security team came in, it was in-house and they hired people to do the job, we were kicking over anthills and finding a whole lot of nastiness. There was no active testing of third-party connections. So right now, can you think of how many don't have to shout it out, but how many organizations you have connected into your own enterprise if you're working in an enterprise? You can think of that right now. Now, that number that you think you know, you may want to increase that because there is always that gap. So you want to really take a good long look at that sort of thing. And that, on that war story, it also leads into the global legal and complexity and human and all the rest of it. As long as you have people touching keyboards, you have a risk. There is always that issue. And the challenges that you have to take into account is that you have to look at it. You have outsourced help desks. You have offshore development centers. You have partner networks. These days, pretty much everybody has a partner network. There's a great site called urlquery.net. If you take a website address, plug it in there, it'll actually do a great little tear it apart and show you all the different aspects and all the calls it makes. But one of the really interesting things is it dynamically creates an image of all the interconnects that that website will have. In some of these instances, you can have that connected to literally hundreds of other websites that are nested 4 deep that you don't actually control. If I'm an attacker and I want to go after your supply chain, and that is your supply chain in a digital sense, I will go after one of those. Is it an ad network? Is it something other? Is it like a tracking cookie? If I want to take you out, I will target that. Not that I'm doing that sort of thing anymore, but, or ever. And that's the real problem, is because that is outside of your control. And these are the things you have to take into account. It's like, oh, but I have this really great widget I want to put on our site. Marketing will go, okay, cool. But the problem there is you don't have control and you don't have the ability to properly secure it in a lot of cases. Things to take into account. Offshore help desk is always a fun one. One organization I worked for, we had an offshore help desk. And when outsourced help desk. Commingling my words, coffee. Now, with this outsourced help desk, it was using a web interface so that people could do all the ticketing system. The problem there was it was running over HTTP. So clear text across the wire for a major enterprise, great. And on top of it, our network folks were probably one of the worst ones. They would paste full Cisco configs into it. So we had Cisco configs going across the wire in the clear. Awesome. It's not like you can't reverse the passwords out of there. Okay, so the geopolitical issue is something that really doesn't get a lot of consideration from my folks that I discussed this with. And this is really something that can affect your supply chain. So if you outsource to India, if you outsource to Malaysia, or wherever it happened to be, you really have to take into account these sort of things. Because if your IT workers end up on a mountain taking naked selfies of themselves and then get arrested, this is something they have to take into account. These are things you have to look at, and as weird as that may sound, I mean, obviously that just happened recently, because apparently they angered the mountain gods. But this is the thing you have to take into account. Are those your people working for you? Now, they now are in a deep pile of legal trouble, and they've actually been removed from being successfully part of your supply chain. And these political issues could really affect your staff. So for example, if you had staff working in Thailand at the time of the coup, they might have been rounded up, and that was a real problem. I was really disappointed because I love Thailand, and I was actually, my wife and I were looking at buying a place there at one point, and then the coup happened, and it was like, okay, we're out. But if you have your companies that are having supplier issues there, you don't really have the ability to extrapolate yourself from that and just say, okay, I'm out of here. It's not nearly as convenient or easy. So these are legal issues like that you really have to take into account. And not being a lawyer, but I stayed at a Weston last night? No. The things that you really have to have a conversation with your legal team about these. And how are these laws going to affect your supply chain? So, for example, Russia had a law that just recently put into effect that any information pertaining to a Russian citizen on a website has to be hosted in Russia. Brazil almost did the exact same thing, but at the 11th hour they said, no, we're going to change this because this is a little bit untenable. And this affects everybody who does business that has a customer that might be Russian. Because then all of a sudden that data they have to store in Russia. And how is that going to affect your supply chain? Do you have the resources set up there to actually do that? Are you storing any data for Russian customers now? Something to actually look into. And also, are you even legally allowed to be operating in that country? There's a series of countries that are referred to as D1 countries in the US nomenclature that you are strictly forbidden from doing business with, and one of them is Syria. Now, I don't want to point any fingers at any particular company, but unfortunately, this one comes to mind because this was actually in the press. Blue Coat, you may or may not be familiar with these folks. They have a proxy type solution where they can actually do web content filtering. They had sold some of their devices that, through a third-party broker, was forwarded on to Syria. And I believe it was 13 of these devices. So these devices were remotely queryable. They call home. So when you put these devices online, they call home to Blue Coat or whoever happened to be that they were using. And so they did have a record that these systems were online. The problem is this is a D1 country. You're not, as Blue Coat is an American company, they were not permitted to actually do this. But the supply chain broke down. They actually didn't know that these devices had ended up in Syria. This was the third-party freight forwarder that actually sent it on. This is a physical issue that manifests as a digital issue because they did have the ability, if they had looked, to see that these devices were calling from Syrian IP addresses. So ultimately, this played out that the third party that they were dealing with in their supply chain had actually been the issue. But the problem is this is a real issue for anybody in this sort of space because ignorance is no defense of the law. The third party got fined $2.8 million, but the problem is nobody remembers the name of the third party. Not a soul. All they remember is Blue Coat. This was exposed by the hacktivists. They admitted, Blue Coat admitted to the failure in their supply chain, and fines were applied to the third party. But Blue Coat unfortunately got to wear that moniker as having the failure. All right, so now I'm going to transition over to one of my favorites here, automated teller machines. Automated teller machines call home. And back in the 90s, they would call home over clear text channels. So all of your banking information at some point was going across the wire, totally interceptable. And the Russian mob, bless their hearts, in Canada at least, they figured this out. So they actually took DATs, digital audio tapes, installed them in the back of the machines that they compromised, and they were recording all this information on these tapes and then duping out cards. And it was very effective until the RCMP had a little chat with them, and that was the end of that. But nowadays, we're seeing more interesting aspects as it applies to ATMs, and this is one of my favorite examples here of a gang that were able to make off with about $45 million by duping ATM systems. So what happened here was they had actually gotten into a card processing company in, okay, I've forgotten where it was, but it was somewhere in Turkey or something to that effect. They were able to compromise that network and actually go and find prepaid credit cards or debit cards, whatever they were, and remove the limits. So they were able to actually dupe all these cards, no limits, run around New York and several other cities in the world, and hit ATMs and dump out as much cash as they could. In New York City alone, they hit just under 3,000 machines in 10 hours, starting on February 19th of, I think it was 2013. But as you can see, these guys were not exactly intellectual giants that they were using for mules. They were taking pictures of themselves with the stacks of money and putting them on Facebook. So needless to say, they were rounded up. And here's an example of the machines they hit over a course of 10 hours. They started here and then worked their way down around the island. Rather ingenious scheme if it wasn't for the fact that these guys were intellectually challenged. So why was this successful? Here's an example of the flow when you're dealing with a payment processor. These are all of the places where an attacker can go after your information or the information of the organization. These are all the steps that you have to make sure that you're protecting, if not yourself, your partners. So you have to make sure you have agreements in place that ensure that they are taking that time, because we've seen time and again where payment processors get compromised, and it has serious ramifications. So what went wrong? They hit a vulnerable financial institution, they were able to compromise the information, and they were able to get credit cards, and this happened actually on 2 different occasions. The leader for the gang, the New York-based crew, actually he met with an untimely end when he was in another place. It was another country, and I guess people didn't like how their share was being divvied out, so he was removed from this realm of existence. Rather unfortunate end, but you live by the sword. Come on. So, transitioning out of that, we're going to talk about intellectual property issues. Now, another popular term is something that we have seen time and again. Having done work for a defense contractor, this always meant, China for us. Now this means any software solution under the sun that does anything remotely associated with security. It's like, yeah, we can take your APT problems, no problem. It's just completely been diluted. But the reality is attackers are going to come after you. They want your source code. They want your intellectual property. They want your credit card numbers. Your personal identity obviously has a monetary value on the dark markets. And a lot of these organizations will use Perforce, Git, whatever it happens to be, and if these systems are not set up properly, you can actually be leaking a lot of information. Now, one particular case, one company I was working at, we had a third-party provider in Russia, I'll say it, and they were doing code development for us, and part of the contract was they were not allowed to see any of the encryption aspects of the code. So they actually went out of their way to strong-arm some of our IT support folks who were also outsourced to another company, and ultimately got access to Perforce and were able to get all the source code that they wanted. And the argument came back to me was, oh, but it's read-only. More coffee. So you really have to look at how is your source code being handled? Where is this going to end up? And this was and I quote, business decision to give them access to the code. Another example of this where you have your intellectual property problems, another organization I had worked at years ago, we had a database with all kinds of secret sauce in it, and it would be backed up once a week, and the backup would be shipped off-site. Great, perfect, awesome. Problem was that was an IP address in a country that we had no dealings with, nor had any control over. Nobody had looked. That had been there for 8 years. So, sorry if there's anybody from Symantec, but I'm going to pick on you guys as well. Here's another example of dealing with your supply chain. Their source code for their antivirus product ended up on a torrent, and there was a case of, oh, it was our third party. This does not absolve you from responsibility because that is part of your supply chain. In this case, the code got leaked actually from their own organization. And this was an unfortunate case. And this really spoke to me because they didn't know where their code was. And this really struck me when, back in about 2008, I was doing some vulnerability research. And one of the things that I came up with here was a vulnerability specific to the reporting module. And this particular library, they took about a year to fix it. And not to pick on them, it's because each individual language pack had their own code tree. So anytime they wanted to update something, they had to go through it and update every single, they didn't just have one library that they could update, they had to update it for each individual language. That's why it took them a better part of a year. This is a real problem because this is not a really good way to do code. So, and Steve didn't get out of bed, so I'm giving him a shout out. Bitly, actually, they had an account breach about a year ago, in which case their information was their database was being stored off-site in a site that they thought was safe, but again, this was a case of a site that was easily compromised, and unfortunately for them, their information got leaked. This is not unique. This happens all the time. Now, when you're dealing with partner networks, it's part of the job. You have to deal with all these different companies. You have to make sure that you're doing a better job of securing it. You have to make sure that you're testing your connections to these third parties. You want trust, but test and verify. All right, so as I'm running out of time quickly, another war story. This is one of my favorites. We had a centralized logging solution which was really good, but until I had showed up at the company, nobody was really leveraging it to any great extent. So myself and another guy started, and we said, okay, well, it was really well installed, we're going to use it. And then within 2 days of us starting the job, they said, okay, we need to know how people from India are actually accessing our network and doing their job. And we're like, okay, sure, that's fine. So we looked at some of the logins, and here is, I'll back up a bit, here is a list of some of the login times on one particular sampling that we did. Nothing really major there on the surface of it. These are different cities within India, and it's like, okay, great. But something about this was tickling my brain. And you know when it's early in the morning, like now, and your brain's not fully kicked in, these things tend to lead you down different paths. So one of the things, being the strange person that I am, I went, okay, I'm going to do, what's the distance and what's the travel time between these two different cities? So I'm like, okay, 9 hours to get there, 11 to get there, and so on and so forth. And I was like, okay, these are pretty well, truly spaced. Why is this bothering me? So then I went and I plotted them on a map. Still don't know why it's bothering me. So I checked these logins and I was like, okay, what was the catch? There's something here. And then it hit me. They were all using exactly the same login, which was using an RSA key fob. So folks in all of these cities were logging in, not out of any malicious intent. They were actually doing their job. We were able to prove that. But they were using the same login key, and what they would do is they'd call somebody who would read them off the next token code so they could log in. They weren't doing anything bad, but this could have gone sideways, maybe not that term. This could have gone badly. And what went wrong here was the contractors that we were dealing with were not properly versed in what is our security posture, what is it that we need to be doing as an organization. They were sharing the same logins. There was no active monitoring in place at all, so we weren't even aware of this until we went digging. And the company did not see fit to penalize the contractor we were using because it would have negatively affected contract negotiations for the renewal. Because yes, we couldn't have that. And it was $6 a head for the people we were using, and they were worried it would go to $7. Okay. We weren't tackling the basics here very well at all. We had failed in our dealing with this. So when you take that on the software side and you look at it, and it's like, okay, well, that couldn't possibly happen with hardware because, you buy a box, you plug it in. And then some researchers discovered a way that they could actually put a Trojanized piece of hardware onto an appliance. And I thought, okay, that would be really crazy if they were actually able to actually take that and inject it in such a way they could actually harvest all your information. You'd never know it was there. And I'm like, no, that couldn't possibly happen. Oh wait, it did. This is actually a picture from the document dump from Snowden, where it shows, allegedly shows NSA folks compromising Cisco devices en route to their destination. And then I thought, okay, well, it couldn't possibly get worse than that, could it? And then the US military says, okay, we're going to have 10 robots per soldier by 2023. Being a sci-fi geek, I'm sitting there going, hey, this is kind of cool, but they all have to communicate, they all have to run software. It's not like they're going to be using them as combatants, right? Yeah. And it couldn't really get worse than this, but obviously I'm having a little fun with you at this point. But so let's look at boil it back down to some practical examples. When you're looking at digital supply chain, point of sale systems obviously has been front and foremost for the last year. This has been an absolute shooting gallery because most of these systems run on Java, and Java is the much maligned, awesome remote access utility that it is, but people tend to like to beat it up. Just put a different label on it and be on your way. So in addition to Home Depot and Target and Goodwill, that we have all kinds of organizations that have fallen afoul of data breaches because of issues within their own digital supply chain. This is a great site that I use called informationisbeautiful.net. So you can go there and you can actually run these sort of lists And it's really interesting because in each one of these bubbles on the active site, you can actually go into it and it'll drill down and get you more information. Very helpful resource. Problem here is this helps to illustrate, oh yeah, this is actually, sorry, yes? They hadn't updated it yet. That would just go whoosh. Incidentally, my data is in the OPM, and I'm sure some of the folks in this room are. And I'm like, great. Thankfully, the data that they have is now out of date. Yes, that would eclipse it, wouldn't it? Oof. So these records here are 30,000 records or higher. And there's, obviously, OPM would just black out the sun. So where do we go from here? How do we actually take care of these issues? And this is one of the things that drives me nuts, is compliance or compliancy. My friend James Arlen and I, years ago, we were both working in the same organization, which will remain nameless. We had a vendor in there, and the vendor was driving us nuts, so we decided we're going to mess with the vendor. Little neuro-linguistic programming. We started using the word compliancy like it was with a purpose. We're sorry. Within a month, we were getting brochures with compliancy on it, and we don't know if we were the ones that affected that, but we take full responsibility. But when you're dealing with compliance regimes, you have to understand you're doing the bare minimum. You're doing just enough to get by. The C-suite wants you to do this because they don't want to end up in a jumpsuit, but you have to understand that if you're going to secure your organization, you have to go well and truly beyond that. And I'm sure the folks in this room actually quite get that very well. When you're dealing with offshore development centers, you have to make sure that you're doing due diligence when you sign the contract. In our case, we had signed a contract, this is long before I came to Akamai. In that company, we had signed a contract, but with no controls in there for security, nothing to do any sort of code escrow, anything like that. So they were shipping us the code, we're going, great, and putting it into production. Anybody see the problem with that? At no point were we vetting the code that was delivered. A real and present problem. And the lowest bid is never the good choice. You want to make sure that when you're putting your bids out to tender, that price is not the piece of the puzzle that's going to tip the scales. You want to make sure that you have security controls in there that are sensible. You don't want to do the flaming sort of justice, you know, the Gandalf, thou shalt not pass. That has limited return because you want to make sure that you're doing security but not going overboard. And you want to make sure that you're dealing with offices that are not in restricted countries. Because your third party may say, oh yeah, our head office is in Delaware, but they have operations in North Korea. Obviously that's a bit of a stretch, but you get the idea. And software liability. This is one of the really interesting ones that have always troubled me, is that my friend FX, he actually put out, he did a keynote for us in Toronto at Sector, and he said, you know, software companies are the only ones outside of drug dealers that refer to their customers as users. I thought that was a rather poignant example. So when you're dealing with software vendors or, you know, having code supplied for your own software, it's like, where's the liability in there? You want to make sure that you're actually looking at it as like, how is this going to affect others if things go sideways? Am I going to be legally liable? So things to take into account. The company White Hat, to give them a shout out, they actually have put their money where their mouth is, that if a company gets compromised as a result of something they missed, that they'll pay out. I was like, it's nice to see somebody stepping up. So how do we get off this hamster wheel of pain? We need to have good we have to have results we can reproduce. Defined repeatable processes. Speaking of defined repeatable processes, you want to make sure that when you're going to do something that you do it right. This happened back in, when was it? It was in the fall. This was great. Remember when Scotland had their vote as to whether or not they're going to be their own country? The vote didn't pass. Neither here nor there on the result, but this was great. This was a company, Made.com, who had put a script so that when it rolled over at midnight, they launched and said, we've added a new country to our shop. Welcome, Scotland! But nobody had thought that wasn't part of the mix. So you want to make sure that if you're going to be doing something, you're going to automate something, that it is actually working to your benefit and not making you a bit of a laughingstock in that respect. You want to make sure that you have defined onboarding procedures for any company that you bring in to deal with your organization. So if you're having a company connect to you, have the security controls in place, have them vetted, background checks, all these wonderful things. Tedious, yes, but things you have to worry about. You also have to look at the budget battle. This is one that I fought so many times that it drove me absolutely to distraction. And this led me to what I call the keep away story. One organization that I worked at, I got the budget approved. It was great. It was like awesome. I could get all of the controls in place that I needed. I could get all the processes defined that I needed. It was awesome. By February 12th, I think it was, the budget was pulled back. I was left with basically nothing. The next year, they did the same thing to me again. And this was absolutely frustrating. So, that success can ultimately lead to failure. Also with your internal applications, like I was saying before, when you're dealing with code from a third party, you want to make sure you're reviewing that code, not just promoting it into production, because either by malicious intent or the oops factor, something could always go very wrong. You want to make sure that you're doing code reviews of anything that you put in, and also that you're properly documenting everything you have. If you have somebody who's developed code for your organization and it's a summer student and then they're gone the next year and there's no documentation, this thing has suddenly become a critical system a year later, and it's running on a desktop on NT4 and they can't promote it because they don't have any documentation. You all get the drill. Now, when you're dealing with these sort of limited resources that you have within your organization, you want to make sure that you're engaging with partners that are going to be able to help you. Be it infrastructure, DNS, web, whatever it happens to be, you want to make sure that these are folks that can help you get the job done, and done well. And you have to go through and you have to vet them and you have to make sure that this is a good thing. And one particular financial institution I worked at, we had outsourced materials to one particular company that actually put an iframe on the logout page of our internet banking application. Not a good idea. So, and this was a particular thing that I raged about for quite some time, and about 2 years after I left, they finally commented out the code. That particular string for the iframe is still there, but they've just commented it out. And this was a case where we had third party that really we shouldn't have been relying on because they had said that this was a good idea. When you're building your software, when you're building your environments, you want to make sure you're building to fail, because you're going to. And if you're not building them systems in this way, this is going to lead to very much heartache. The whole idea of having a hot standby and all that sort of thing, that has been deprecated at this point. You want to make sure that you're building systems that can take a beating. So 5 nines doesn't really cut it anymore. Netflix is a great example. They have something they call the Chaos Monkey, which has since promoted into other iterations of a Gorilla, I've been told. But this is great. It would just randomly go through their network and just down systems. I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. And then I was told by my CISO at Akamai, Andy Ellis, he said, well, we have our own Chaos Monkey. And I said, oh, yeah. Well, he goes, the internet. Fair play, fair play. So I'm stealing this liberally from Pierre Noel, the CISO for Microsoft Asia. He said, your supply chain, you have to look at it as you would bamboo. When a storm comes up, the bamboo will bend, but ultimately will return back to its original form. If it breaks, that's a storm that you're not going to weather anyway, but you have to make sure that your digital supply chain has the ability to withstand these sort of attacks, these sort of complications, and the legal and global issues that will pop up. You want it to be able to bend, but not break. Now, having gone through the CFP process for Circle CityCon, I want to say thank you to the organizers of Circle CityCon because they gave me feedback before I did my presentation. When I did my submission for my CFP, I didn't do a particularly good job of submitting it, and I didn't notice that I had goofed. But they still went through it and they got the gist of the content that I was delivering, and they actually gave me all kinds of great feedback that I've actually used to submitting for other CFPs. But I want to say thank you to the organizers, the volunteers for Circle City for having me, and I definitely want to say thank you to you guys who were good enough to show up at this bright and bleary hour. And yes, so if you have any questions, I am at your leisure. Thank you.
Do you find that DLP is useful for third-party connections?
The problem is with DLP, and I'm not going to pick on them, it's not the product itself, it's the configuration that's where it falls down. And you don't always get good people deploying it, and it's not to beat up on them, it's just some people don't have that particular skill set. So it does require a lot of care and feeding. Does it have the potential to be successful? Yes, absolutely. But that's only one piece of the puzzle. You want to look at it as, you know, to steal Boeing's analogy, I think it was. Was it Boeing? Anyway, the defense in depth analogy. You want to make sure you're doing a layered approach. Any other questions? All right then. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.